the past 6 months alone, the publishing industry has seen the deplorable behavior of 3 preeminent writers exposed. In July of 2024, 2 women accused Neil Gaiman of SA. Just days later, Alice Munro's daughter revealed her mother ignored the SA she suffered by the hands of her stepfather. In November, an article in Vanity Fair revealed that in the 70s, Cormac McCarthy had a relationship with a 16-year-old when he was in his 40s. And most recently, more details on the allegations against Gaiman came to light, exposing a situation that is far, far worse than we thought. Gaiman, Munro, and McCarthy are some of the most renowned names in literature, and their influence has spanned upwards of 6 decades. Many of McCarthy's books are counted among the great American novels. Gaiman has one of the largest and most loyal followings in sci-fi and fantasy. And Munro won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2013. Yet they've all been accused of some of the most reprehensible things a person can do. How do we live with that? We have essentially 2 options: swear off their work forever, or continue to engage with it to a greater or lesser extent. The best case scenario is that you've never read any of their books and have no interest in doing so, in which case, congratulations, you get to avoid a deeply personal and emotional moral quandary for now. When the allegations against Gaiman first came out in July, I made a shorter, more casual video about the situation and cautioning readers not to idolize these writers whom we don't truly know. This time around, I don't plan on discussing the case itself much. I would encourage you to read the Vulture article if you haven't already. Although if you're considering doing so, please be aware that it is extremely graphic and upsetting. Instead, I'm going to make the case for why it is okay to continue to read and love an author's work even when their true character has been revealed. I'll be making some of the same points as I did in that first video. However, this time around, I'm going to back them up with some literary and aesthetic theory, as well as a dash of philosophy. I will be using Gaiman's work as an example throughout, simply because he's the writer on most people's minds at the moment. And frankly, given the severity of the allegations, I believe he will go down as one of, if not the most abhorrent authors in modern history. Before we get into it, I want to make a quick note about who this video is for. I'm not here to argue that every reader must continue reading the work of a writer who's done something bad, but rather to lay out how this is a complex personal decision that can be very difficult for a lot of readers, and how choosing to continue engaging with such a writer can be a valid decision when considered carefully. My goal is not to change your mind, but to offer some food for thought that might help you along in the process of making up your own mind. Why do we even care about books enough to feel conflicted? Shouldn't the answer be obvious? If we wouldn't want to interact with someone who's been accused of violence out in the world, why would we even consider reading their books? The American philosopher and educator John Dewey, not to be confused with Melville Dewey of Dewey Decimal fame, may be able to help us out here. In his essay Art as Experience, Dewey posits that our ordinary everyday experience is fractured, imperfect, and flows on in one long continuity. Sometimes the habitual yet chaotic progression of life is interrupted by a series of moments that make up a unity with a beginning, a middle, and an end. For example, a meal, a game, or a storm. And these are capital E experiences. It's not a meal, but that meal. It's not a game, but that game, not a storm, but that storm. These experiences wake us up and jolt us out of the humdrum daily grind and into consciousness. More often than not, these experiences become memories we can look back on as the scenes that make up our lives, for better or worse. Dewey argued that art can be one such experience, and though he's referring to all art forms, I personally think literature is the prime example of this. Novels, stories, poems, plays, etc. have a beginning, a middle, and an end that make up a unified whole. While you're reading a story, you're having the experience of that story. You are alert to something, conscious of something totally outside your everyday life. The more captivated we are by a story, the more immersed in it we are, the more likely we are to absorb it into our consciousness, into our memory, and feel like we really lived it. When our appreciation of a book reaches that height, how could we not feel conflicted when our capital E experience is tainted by an outer circumstance that we had no clue was happening, that we had no control over? It's essentially finding out that that precious memory you have is wrong. Unlike the experiences of a good meal or a fierce storm, the experience of a great book originates in the mind of a human being. and human beings tend to cause problems. Every time a prominent writer behaves badly, you hear the term the death of the author thrown around a lot. Well, what exactly does that mean, and can the concept help us tease out our relationships to these authors and their work? I'll tell you, and I think it can. The Death of the Author is a 1968 essay by the French literary theorist Roland Barthes. First and foremost, the death of the author does not mean we can pretend a writer does not exist if we have a problem with him as a person, nor does it give readers carte blanche to continue supporting him. Rather, the death of the author is an approach to literary analysis in which Barthes posits that the author is not the ultimate authority on how a reader should interpret a text, and the author's intentions are not the only objectively correct meaning of that text.
Side note, you probably also heard the term separate the art from the artist, and that means essentially the same thing. That too originated in academia as a means of artistic analysis, and neither term was ever intended to absolve an artist of their wrongdoings.
Of course, the essay goes quite a bit deeper, and I'm going to do my best to summarize it as simply as possible. Often, we have a tendency to think of the author as a sort of divine creator. Barthes uses the term author god, an inspired individual who turns a blank page into a work of literary art as if by magic or genius. Barthes is asking us to shift away from this idea. Rather than a divine creator, an author is more like a collage artist who's bringing together numerous cultural influences and presenting them in a new way. He writes, "A text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash." In other words, art is not created in a vacuum, and there are no new ideas under the sun. Everyone and everything that influenced the writer had a hand in the creation of the writing. Let's use Gaiman's novel The Graveyard Book as an example. The Graveyard Book is a YA novel about a young orphaned boy who's living with a new family of ghosts in a graveyard. Both the title and the plot probably sound familiar to you if you've ever read Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book or seen the Disney movie. Gaiman explicitly set out to write a graveyard version of The Jungle Book, and some chapters are direct retellings of Kipling's original story. Older readers might also notice some allusions to A Tale of Two Cities, Robinson Crusoe, The Haunting of Hill House, and history and fairy tales more generally. Though this example is a more obvious one, it does illustrate well how a book does not spring purely out of the writer's individual consciousness, and therefore, in this case, Gaiman can't be the ultimate authority on what the Graveyard Book is supposed to mean. To take it one step further, because a work of literature is laden with various influences, the writer's psyche being only one of them, readers can never discern which parts of the work reflect the writer's true intentions, beliefs, or biography. After news broke about the Gaiman allegations and more details surfaced, you might have heard people say things like, "Oh, I could just tell from his writing that he was a creep." To that, Bart would say, "Like hell you did, that's impossible." In a similar vein, this is also why it doesn't quite make sense to assume that if a character in a book holds problematic beliefs, the author must hold those beliefs too. That's not to say those things can't be true, but rather we can't know for a fact they are true just by reading the book. You'd have to do research into the author themselves to find out. Now, if a writer comes to a book with all sorts of baggage, so too does the reader. And here's where things get really interesting and more relevant to our problem today. From perhaps the most often quoted line from The Death of the Author is the final line. "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." If the author is not the final authority on a text, then the reader is free to interpret as they wish. How they do so will be affected by, you guessed it, all of their unique cultural influences and biographical experiences. This is why, though you and I may be reading the same book, we're going to have two totally different experiences of it because we're two different people who lived two different lives. This is also why you might have a completely new interpretation of the same book you read 10 years ago. You've lived more in that time and gathered new influences and experiences. In fact, Barthes states that writing is not truly completed until it is read and interpreted. There is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was hitherto, the author. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. This means that the reader, too, plays a part in the creation of the text. Think for a moment of your all-time favorite novel, the one that has had the most profound impact on your life that you return to again and again. Mine is To the Lighthouse, in case you're wondering. Doesn't it feel like it's your book? Maybe even more your book than the author's? Well, given what we just learned about the death of the author, It kind of is. Only you could have had the specific experience of and relationship to the book that you had because you are a one of a kind individual. For this reason, literature can be deeply personal and intimate. If we demand that readers stop loving the books that they love because of the author's actions, we're asking them to give up something that they had a hand in creating, something that will become one of the influences that they might bring to their own writing and their future reading. And that's a gargantuan demand. It's giving up a part of yourself. I don't believe there's any shame or immorality in admitting that you're not able or willing to do that. I'll be honest about my own case. Virginia Woolf was not a perfect person by any means. She was known at times to be anti Semitic, racist, and though she was a feminist, her feminism really only extended to middle and upper middle class white women. I know this, I acknowledge it, I accept it, and I still love her work, and I can't not. Prioritizing your aesthetic experience as a reader and the creative act of reading can be a way of taking power back from an author, I think, of taking them off the pedestal. I consider this an inversion of separating the art from the artist. By refraining from idolizing an artist simply because we love their art, we can avoid or absolving them of their wrongdoing and further perpetuating the pain that they've caused. The unfortunate reality is that horrible people can make great art. Art that travels to the depths of our souls and speaks to the core of our being. You can't help the fact that the work in question had an effect on you. You didn't choose to love that book any more than you made the author do what they did or say what they said. It is possible, though uncomfortable, to occupy a middle ground where you can hold the writer accountable for their actions while honoring your connection to the work and what it gave you. And that's not to say your relationship to a book can't or won't change after allegations or revelations arise. Maybe 3 years from now, you come back to, say, Dear Life or American Gods and don't feel the same affection for it, but that doesn't mean your previous love of it was built on a lie. Call to mind again that one special novel. I don't know what it is for you, but I am willing to bet that something in that book taught you to live life better. It inspired you to approach the world in a new way. What if, in situations like these, we could intentionally use literature to help us make sense of them? Can the work itself shine a light on how to make peace with our new relationship to its creator? I mentioned in a previous video that I love McCarthy's novel, The Road, and I even argued in an essay once that the boy's character is an allegory for the second coming of Christ, because he operates from this place of divine love and forgiveness despite the apocalyptic setting surrounding him. Perhaps those very concepts of love and forgiveness, as written in The Road, can help me come to terms with the writer whom I now find unsavory. Personally, I believe that in the long run, it is more beneficial for us to sit with and confront this complexity head on rather than throw away a whole body of work in a knee-jerk reaction. Even if all the writers and artists and musicians, etc., that you love are totally unproblematic people, which is quite impossible, but let's pretend, even if that's the case, eventually in your life, someone you love is going to screw up. Someone you admire is going to turn out not to be who you thought they were. You're going to end up in some situation of intense internal conflict. In those real life dilemmas, it's going to be a lot harder to cut someone off or disengage entirely. One of the amazing things about art, and literature specifically, is that it creates a space in which we can practice in imagination how to respond to reality. So how do we respond to reality? The cold, hard reality that crappy people stand to benefit financially from our engagement with their work. As mentioned earlier, the death of the author and separating the art from the artist don't absolve creators of their wrongdoings, nor do they give consumers permission to continue on as if nothing happened. How to move forward, of course, depends on several factors, including, is the writer alive? Is their work in the public domain or is it under copyright? Do you already own their work? And of course, the details of the situation. In the case of writers who died long enough ago that their work is in the public domain, you're golden. For writers like Munro and McCarthy, who are deceased but whose work is still under copyright, you don't have to worry about them as individuals profiting off of you, but usually either their family, their heirs, or their estate will. Whether you're okay with that depends on who exactly owns the copyright and to what extent they may have potentially been involved in the situation. And of course, it's going to vary widely and be a case by case basis, and it assumes that we're buying new. The case of a living writer is where we have the most deliberation to do, and where it becomes truly impossible to separate the art from the artist because there is a direct link from the art to the artist's bank account. At the end of the day, how you spend your money is a personal, private decision that I can't make for you, nor do I want to. However, I will say that even if you do come to the conclusion that you can bring yourself to continue engaging with a writer's work, that you can still find an appreciation of it and some value in it, that does not mean you need to own the book. Luckily for us, it is easier than ever to avoid buying books brand new. Used book sales, libraries, book swaps, whether online or in person, borrowing from a friend, all of these are ways of acquiring a book or accessing literature without funding the author directly. And also, let's be real, this is the internet. I'm sure you can find a PDF of anything you want if you know where to look. I don't know where to look, so I can't help you there. I'm just saying. Now, in some special cases, a writer's influence extends beyond their books, and Gaiman is a perfect example of this. He doesn't just have books and comics, but also movies, television shows, all sorts of merch. The royalties from all of that will benefit him and have already made him a very wealthy man. And unless you happen to already own a DVD of one of his movies, there's not much of a workaround. But on that note, I want to return to the idea of the author not being a god and not creating art in a vacuum. When we're talking about projects in a different media that have grown out of a piece of writing, we're no longer talking about a single person's work. Let's take the Coraline movie, for example. I know a lot of people love that one. Yes, Gaiman's novel is the source material. If you enjoy that film, you're not just enjoying his creation. You're enjoying the creation of the directors, the voice actors, the animators, the composers, designers, producers, editors, etc., most of whom, I assume, are generally good, normal people.
Allow me to take this opportunity to introduce you to Althea Crome, who's the artist behind the knitwear you see in Coraline. Both the star sweater and the striped gloves were hand knit with a technique called micro knitting, and as a knitter myself, I could tell you this takes an incredible amount of skill that very few people have. So while it's uncomfortable to watch this movie that was originally Gaiman's idea, it might also be your only opportunity to be exposed to and appreciate this incredibly talented artist.
I mention this to further underscore just how many shades of gray there are in this dilemma, and also to suggest that perhaps the revelation of a writer's true character can be our invitation to focus on the more communal side of creativity. By focusing our energy on purging anything Gaiman touched from our lives, we're accidentally diverting attention away from other related talented artists who did nothing wrong, allegedly. I so wish I had a clean and easy answer for you, a black and white yes or no. Perhaps, if nothing else, this sort of situation can be a lesson in learning to accept that that clean and easy answer we so desire maybe just doesn't exist, and how we have to make peace with that. To wrap things up, I want to draw your attention to an essay called The 70% by writer Yi-Yoon Lee, published in Harper's in November of last year. You might know of her novels The Book of Goose and Wednesday's Child. This essay is wonderful, and I highly recommend you give it a read. I will link it in the description down below alongside all of my other references and sources. In the essay, Lee discusses how when she teaches Tolstoy's War and Peace, her students often get frustrated, even offended, that she would teach a writer whose biography does not live up to modern moral values, particularly because he was an aristocrat and a patriarch. Near the end of the essay, she brings up a lesson her father taught her that was from a Song Dynasty poem. He estimated that we find life, people, situations, conditions, below our expectations 80% of the time. The two lines from the poem, roughly translated, read thus: 8 or 9 out of 10 things in life won't be to your liking, and yet you can speak about no more than 2 or 3 with others. Lee then applies this concept to the spectrum of opinions people can have about any given issue. For any society, regarding any proposition, the population will spread out on a spectrum. 20% will strongly disagree, 70% will be more ambivalent, and 10% will be in total agreement. Someone falling into that 10% may feel that the rest of the population fails to meet their expectations. Those 20% on the other side, one suspects, will not change their minds, and we are hemmed in by them. And yet it may not be wise to treat the middle 70% as though they were the same as the 20%. I found this idea quite fascinating because, although of course it is unscientific and hypothetical, we can apply it pretty directly to the discussions that we're having more often on ethics and morality in the arts. To use Gaiman as an example one final time, and then I hope to never mention him on this channel again, when applied to his fan base, the 70% rule might look like this. 20% of readers won't give a shit and will continue to stand by him. 10% are entirely done with him and will condemn anyone who isn't. And everyone else, the 70%, are struggling with the layers, the complexity, the personal, emotional involvement, and the impossible ambiguity that makes up the human condition. Lee argues, as do I, that belonging to that majority in the middle is not the same thing as belonging to the uncritical and ever-supportive 20%. She concludes, the 70% in the middle have the potential to shift towards something better, so long as the 10% do not hold them in utter contempt because they don't meet their expectations. And this is my ultimate point, which Lee writes more succinctly than I could. Readers who end up occupying one of those shades of gray have the opportunity to craft a more nuanced, a more complete understanding of art, of the world, and of themselves, so long as they are not shamed or denigrated for doing so. It is entirely possible, though certainly not easy, to acknowledge the harm an author caused and ask that they be brought to justice, while also acknowledging that art is a living thing that transcends the person who created it, and their actions, their beliefs, do not have to define your experience. Well, those are all the thoughts I can muster on this astoundingly convoluted topic for today. I hope at least one of these thoughts inspired some of your own, and maybe even brought a little bit of comfort to anyone who's grieving an author they admired. If that's true for even one of you, then I will have done my job and I will sleep well tonight. I'm curious what your thoughts are, if you can bring yourself to read authors with allegations against them, if you've had any personal experience in this arena, if you have any ideas on how to avoid supporting these writers that I might have missed. I'm sure there are some. Now, given the sensitive nature of this topic, I hope that we as readers and lovers of the arts can approach each other with openness and compassion, regardless of where you each stand on the issue, and whether you've been personally affected by any of the recent allegations or not. Thank you all so very much for spending your time with me today and for making it all the way through this important but not particularly fun discussion. If you enjoyed this video and got something out of it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up to support the channel, and maybe also consider subscribing if you're new around here. I have more literary video essays in the works that I think will be very exciting. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.